Welcome to our third lecture in this distance learning platform. Today we're going to be talking about adolescent relationships, and we're going to start by talking about peers and friends, and then go into romantic relationships at least a little bit, and then we'll end with parent-child relationships. We already talked about peers when we talked about children's development and how peers are really, really important for socialization and broadly in terms of social and emotional development. So I hope it is clear already why it is important to study peers. That said, in adolescence, we see a lot of changes take place um, to us broadly when we're thinking about peers and peer relationships. So, why would we study them? Why are they important? Surely, again, still for socialization purposes, but why else? So, some of the main reasons that emerge from, just common knowledge, but also the research, include that in the United States and other parts of the Western world, we're spending a lot of time with peers. In fact, almost double the amount of time with peers as we are with adults. So we're learning a lot about ourselves and our identities. We're negotiating different decision-making skills that we haven't had to necessarily use in the same way in childhood, and we're doing that around peers. So just a lot of time. One of the other main reasons why we study peers is we know that this is a context where moods are most positive, and not just peers, this is specifically with friends, but this is a specific and unique context to understand emotions and how those change depending on the context and the people that we're with. Another reason why we study peers is because we know that this is a cross-cultural phenomenon, the idea that we're hanging out with peers more in adolescents than in adults. Not just hanging out with them, but sharing things with them. We're going to talk about intimacy later in this lecture. So we have a lot of contact with peers. In the United States, the definition of peers, we've already talked about this when we were discussing childhood, is more narrowly defined and age segregated, which I'm going to talk about just a bit more in a second. So usually your peers and your friends are within, let's say, 2 or 3 years of you in either direction. In other parts of the world, the definition of who counts as a peer is, even in adolescence, is much broader. So just be keeping that in mind when we're talking about peers today, that although every single individual around the globe is interacting with peers on some level, who counts as a peer and who doesn't is going to look a little bit different. Within the United States, I was already talking about this in the last lecture on social groups and how children had to go into the workforce. And when they were going out in the workforce, they were interacting with people from all different types of backgrounds and all different ages. So along those same lines, what I'm talking about here is age grading, and it's not until roughly the 1850s in the United States that we started to see individuals being separated by their ages in schools. Now, again, this depended on where you lived. If you were in an urban area versus a rural area, we know that rural area schools were still open to, and had classrooms with people from a broad range of ages. But still, this isn't, that old essentially that we were separated by age until roughly 1930, and we can argue again, depending on your socioeconomic status and where you lived in the United States, maybe even later. High school was still deemed a luxury, something that was only for the rich. So when we're talking about separating students into different ages or different grades depending on their ages, this was something that still in, let's say, the 1930s, 1940s, wasn't experienced by everyone in the same way. So broadly, when we're talking about peer groups that are based on school friendships, which is what most of our peer groups are based on, at least in adolescence, this isn't something that developed until well into the 20th century. If you think back to high school, most of your friends are going to be, or again, at that time at least, people who were in your same classes, usually again within 1 or 2 years older or younger than you are. And so this is a very common phenomenon, but it wasn't always this way. So I'm going to be talking in the next two slides about how the peer group changes in adolescence and why the peer group changes in adolescence. On this slide, you see four different points, and it certainly isn't the case that the peer group only changes in four ways. But this is a summary of some of the main findings in the empirical research. So think about these in relation to your own life and how these aspects of the peer group that have changed affected you in terms of your identity or in terms of your autonomy. Remember, we haven't fully talked about that as a concept on its own yet, but this idea of independence. So the first way that the peer group really changes in adolescence is just like we already talked about, that we're spending more time with peers and significantly less time with parents. This research finding is a little bit more nuanced, though, in terms of some gender differences. So for boys, we see that yes, they are spending more time with parents or with peers and less time with parents, but they're also spending a significant more time alone. For girls, we tend to see that yes, they are also spending some time alone, but really more time with friends. And that doesn't have to be in physical proximity to friends. This could also be over social media or video chats or over the phone. So we do see a difference where boys start to separate from parents in a way that's toward peers, but also, again, towards more alone time. And for girls, it's a combination of all, three. Some parents, lots more peers, and more time alone. The second way that the peer group changes is that this is like the first time in your life as an adolescent that you're functioning without adult supervision. So this changes a lot of things. You are able to share more with your friends without worrying about what parents might hear or think or say. Able to make decisions. We've already talked about this a little bit on your own or again with peers around. And this can really affect the way that we see ourselves in terms of our identity and in terms of our autonomy. This is a big change. The third way, again, based on the research, that peer groups change is that we're spending more contact time with other sex friends. In childhood, we didn't talk about it that much, but we did talk about it a little bit. The idea that typically our friends are the same gender as us. And that comes down to a lot of different reasons why. You may have remembered from elementary school with circle, circle, dot, dot. Now I have my cootie shot. This idea that girls would do this or boys would do that to separate. But in adolescence, that changes, for many at least. And so we start to see groups becoming more mixed in terms of individuals from different genders. And we'll talk more about that. Lastly, one of the main findings in the empirical research on adolescent development is that although this might go counter to your ideas, we typically find that kids groups are pretty small when they're actually talking about friends. So usually kids groups are pretty small, but adolescents groups are much larger. I'm not talking about your best friends in this situation. I'm talking about with the group level. We start to develop mini cultures. I have two examples here of the jocks or the brains, and we're going to talk more about this in just a few slides. But as a whole, adolescent groups are getting bigger. Again, this is not supposed to be talking about your individual friend group. Those can be big, those can be small and in childhood and in adolescence. But we're talking more about at the group level here. So these are, again, just the four main ways in which, or of the main ways in which peer groups change in adolescence. Hopefully you're thinking, to yourself right now, yeah, Dr. Nordling, I remember these changes happening, or I understand that those are the big changes, but why? Why does it change? And if you're not asking yourself that question, it's okay. It's right here on the slide. But it changes because of these three fundamental changes that we've already talked about in this class. They're changing because of biological reasons, cognitive reasons, and social changes. Again, these are the three big areas of change that are taking place, and they affect all of our relationships and our overall psychosocial functioning. So, one of the reasons why we see those changes in peer groups in adolescence is biological. This idea that we start to be interested in people in a romantic or sexual way. So, because of puberty and we have these hormonal changes, some of the reasons why the peer groups change in terms of who you're hanging out with and people from different genders is because of this interest, this biological interest. Most of the research on this area is very heteronormative, meaning that most of the research is looking at opposite sex or opposite gender individuals. But and that's a definite fault in the field of psychology broadly, not just developmental psychology. But nevertheless, we do know that there is research that supports this idea that because we are having this flood of hormones, that we want to start to interact with people who are attractive to us. Another reason why it changes is for cognitive reasons. We start to have this more abstract understanding of friendships, of peer groups. We've already talked about these changes in cognitive development. So when we have this abstract understanding, we can start understanding social groups. Like, what does it mean to be put into one category or group versus another category or group? So, for example, if you are placed in the, in the goths, what does that actually mean? If you're placed in this group of athletes, what does that actually mean? What does that mean for you? What does that mean for how people see you? This isn't something that's always tangible. It is more abstract. Again, we're just understanding relationships as a whole that are inherently abstract. And then socially, we are typically moving from a smaller school, so not everybody, and if I were in front of you right now, I'd ask you how many of you went to a really small school. But typically the case is that elementary schools are smaller, you have your smaller class that you hang out with, then you move to a junior high or middle school and it's bigger, and then a high school is even bigger than that. And so when you are moving from these smaller groups to these bigger groups, you're able to find a crowd that has similar interests or values to you. So it changes the way, that again, you see yourself, but who you're hanging out with. And it also is setting up the idea that we're having these larger groups of peers in adolescence.